Good evening, members. Good evening, officers. Good evening to members of the public. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee for BCP Council. We've got quite a large agenda to deal with this evening, and I'm going to be welcoming one or two members along the way and officers for particular items. And I believe that once the briefing has been completed elsewhere, that the Chief Executive will be joining us for some of the later items on the agenda. So without further ado, could I pass over to Mr. Hanton from Democratic Services to run through the general procedures and then take us through items 1 to 3 on the agenda. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Just the general housekeeping notice. Could members please note that the meeting of the committee is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council's website for a minimum of 6 months. To ensure that the meeting is managed effectively, please could everybody present follow these ground rules for speaking. Only speak when invited, Chairman. Always turn on your video function when invited to speak. Please state your name before you speak if you have not been introduced by name. Mute your microphone when you are not talking. If you would like to speak on an item, please do so by utilising the raise your hand feature in the bar at the top of the Teams window. The message bar should not be used unless you are raising a point of order or providing the wording for a motion. Please remember the message bar is visible to all. If at any point you would like to speak again, please use the raise your hand function again. If there is a recommendation move that requires a formal note, this will be by the Democratic Services Officer carrying out a roll call of members present and asking for a response of for or against or abstain. And finally, Chairman, please could all members ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you. And then moving on, Chairman, to the agenda, item 1, apologies. We've had apologies from Councillor Tony Trent. And then on to item 2, the Chairman, Councillor Mike Cox, is acting tonight as substitute for Councillor Trent. Item 3, Chairman, is to invite any declarations of interest. And I've had an email from Councillor Brooke, and I think he wishes to make a declaration.
Thank you. Just to note that as Vice Chairman of Broad, it relates to item 7 on the agenda, the constitutional changes. There are references there to neighbourhood forums. Thank you. It's a local interest.
Councillor Phipps has raised her hand.
Yeah, in the light of that, I'm chairman of Herne Parish Council, and parish councils are mentioned, so perhaps I'd just better declare an interest as well. I wasn't going to, I didn't realise it was necessary, but as Councillor Brooke has, I will do the same. Thank you. And
from me, Councillor John Beasley, Mr. Hanton, in respect of item 6 on the agenda, which is the presentation on housing companies, to declare that I'm a director of Seascape Group Limited, a council wholly owned by BCP Council. We have those 3 declarations. Is everybody content that we move on? I think so. In that case, we take item 4 on the agenda, which is the confirmation of the minutes of the 22nd of October 2020. In common with other meetings, I will take it that all are in agreement on items when I ask, unless you indicate, please, in the sidebar, or indeed if you've already raised your hand. So in terms of the minutes for the 22nd of October 2020, I am moving those as a true record of that meeting, and await if there's anybody who disagrees with that. And secondly, I don't believe from that meeting there are any matters arising not covered elsewhere on this agenda. Nobody has indicated, in which case we'll move on to item 5 on the agenda, public issues. Mr. Hanton.
Chairman, there are no public issues.
Thank you very much. Item 6 on the agenda is the governance overview of BCP housing companies. And we're going to receive a short PowerPoint and verbal presentation on governance issues, and it will be strictly defined to governance issues, after which we'll take questions once the presentation has been concluded. So this presentation has been supported by the Executive Director, Kate Ryan, who is not with us this evening, but our Lorraine Mealings, who's the Director of Housing for BCP Council, and Shane Egan, who is the new Company Secretary for our housing companies. And I think, Mr. Egan, you're going to start the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can see me. What I'm going to do is bring the presentation up now. And hopefully you can see it. If you can just confirm you can see the presentation, that'd be good.
Yes, I certainly can.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Right. It's a very short presentation on a number of wholly owned companies that are owned by BCP, in particular the Seascape Group and Bournemouth Building and Maintenance, which I'll call BBML from now on. Quite simply, what we're trying to do here in this presentation is give you an overview of the governance arrangements for these companies and talk about the assurance that we have in place and are putting in place in terms of governance reporting for each of the companies. Basically, that's an outline of the contents of the presentation. And basically, what will happen during the presentation is I will start off the presentation on who we are, and then Lorraine will take over on the plans for these various companies, and then I'll finish off on the various forms of assurance that we're developing in each of the companies. And then it'll be over to you after a brief conclusion from Lorraine for any questions. So moving on, basically the big question is who are these companies? They're BCP. But probably the best thing to do is go into the history very quick together. As you can see, they were set up between 2013 and 2016, and have been operating since then, developing, stabilizing, growing. Effectively, there are two streams or two corporate structures. One is Seascape Group, and what Seascape Group does is deliver services externally to the council. Some of those services are very relevant for the council, such as with Seascape Homes and Property Limited, who do social letting. And then there's BBML, which is wholly owned by BCP. It's a TECL company. TECL is an exemption from public procurement processes because basically BBML is wholly to the council, and they deliver maintenance and parks services on behalf of the council. Moving on, you can see here the purposes and act in more detail. Seascape Group is a corporate coming together. It's a way of consolidating the seascape companies into one reporting line, which is very important because we want to have clear line of sight of the financial activities of the various companies into the council. Below Seascape Group, there is Seascape South Limited, which provides building works non-council tenants or non-council clients. And there's another company, Seascape Homes and Property Limited, which lets properties from the council, but these are used in the main to provide short-term lets to homeless persons. So in some ways, it's helping the council deliver what it needs to deliver. On the other side of the wholly owned companies equation is BBML, and they provide maintenance works and services to the council, especially in the housing area, but they also supply services to the Parks Department in terms of parks operatives and the catering services that we offer in the parks. So that's how it all fits together. The key thing to remember is that these are standard companies, but they have a strategic purpose. Seascape Group is about delivering a return to the council, and they are beginning to do that. Whereas BBML is primarily established to help deliver value for money to the council in terms of delivering services, and they've been successfully doing that for a number of years. Now, over to Lorraine to take over. Are we there, Lorraine?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Shane. Okay, just a quick introduction. As I say, I'm Lorraine Mealings, Director of Housing at BCP. I know quite a lot of the faces on the call. So in terms of the future plans, I think, which is where we are in the presentation, we've obviously been consolidating the companies over the last year and developing. So the slides that we've got here kind of articulate where we think we're going with each of the companies. So as Shane's described, Seascape Group Limited is really a holding company that sits over the two subsidiaries, so needs to make sure that we've got all the governance in place for the two subsidiaries, etc., making sure that those subsidiaries are delivering profits, really that overall governance. So we need to sort of tighten up the governance and the reporting for Seascape Group. But moving importantly onto our ambitions are over the next 5 years. So we've got Seascape South Limited, which, as Shane has described, delivers private construction work to people outside of the council to generate profits back to the shareholder, which is obviously the council. So what we see as the future plan for Seascape South is really twofold. As a contractor of choice to people that receive disabled facilities grant money from us. So that grant is essentially for people, private tenants, private owners, to fund aids and adaptation to their home to live independently. And they can choose a contractor to do that. So we do the lion's share of that work as Seascape South. We really want to develop that contractor delivery across the whole of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and increase our share of that disabled facilities grant work. And secondly, we really want to grow that private construction business. So there is quite significant scope to go out, market that, invest in services, no doubt, to make real profits and bring that back to the local authorities. So moving on to Seascape Homes and Property Limited, the three areas of work that we want to develop for Seascape Homes and Property is firstly to continue delivering the service short hold tenancies to our homeless households that we've got statutory duty to as a local authority. We can't as a local authority grant certain types of tenancy, but you can if you're a private company, a private landlord. Seascape Homes and Property does. So continue with that, more of the same. We also want to use that company structure to build homes on council-owned land for private rent and private sale. Again, to meet housing needs, housing demands for the area, but importantly, potentially bring surplus to the shareholder, which is BCP Council. And thirdly, we really want to expand our letting services to being agents for market rented properties. So not subsidised rents, for full market rent properties. And as you probably know, the rental market within BCP areas is really quite buoyant. And for all of these activities, we want to do that across Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. So really expanding the geography across all three areas within the new local. So if any of you want to find out a little bit more about that, there's an email link in the slides. So I think we're going to circulate the slides around, so you can click on that and your 5-year ambition document, as it's called, which went to Cabinet back in May, which articulates the 5-year plan for the whole seascape group and subsidiaries, which obviously provides much more detail. It is to increase the turnover of the seascape companies quite over the 5 years period, and also improve reporting and visibility of seascape within BCP. Okay, the next slide, Shane, I think is on BBML. You can move on.
Yeah, it should be coming up now.
Okay, yep, lovely. Okay, there's a lot on this slide. I won't go through line by line, but broadly, BBML is really quite an operational company. It employs around about 200 operatives, mainly working in housing, some of which are working also in parks. So there's a kind of our plan really is to make sure that got effective governance, reporting, value for money, and is working operationally as effective as it can be. And alongside that, we're also reviewing the company model of delivering those services within BBML. So obviously your property maintenance function going on. There's a whole wider transformation agenda for BCP. So we're at the moment we're reviewing what the future of BBML might be in terms of the company model going forward, and looking at various options for the future. The next slide, Shane.
That's over to me, I think.
Okay, and back to you, Shane, then.
Okay, moving on, I just want to go through very quickly some of the areas of internal and external assurance that we have developed and will be delivering upon for the wholly owned company. And really it's about linking to BCP's own assurance structures and the sources of assurance, the 3 lines of defence that are really critical for all public organisations. And we want to apply those principles to these companies, even though they are private, simply because it's all about openness, accountability, and really good standards. So just very quickly, I can report that there's quite a good first line of defence in terms of delivering assurance. There are good existing systems and processes in terms of management and oversight. But we are working on developing better governance and recording. You can always improve. And critically, because we have a business plan for Seascape Group, and we have business line plans for BBML, it's critical that we have good quality business plan, operational and risk reporting delivered on a continuous basis within the companies. And that area is the area that we're focusing on right at the moment. Just improve those reporting lines and improve the visibility of those controls. Then another key line of defence in terms of oversight and governance of these entities, and this is the 3rd line of defence, if you like, the external assurance. Each of the companies has oversight from key council executives and monitoring officers. Definitely have a very keen interest in all the activities of the companies and reporting any key issues. Each of the companies have councillor members as directors of the company, and that gives a clear line of sight of the activities and reporting within the companies. And each of the companies is subject to external audit by independent auditors on an annual basis. We are completing this year's audit right at present. But also we operate within the council's internal audit framework, and I'll be reporting about that in a second, but we fully support that and cooperate with any activities that the internal audit programme undertakes. And connected to that really is, and this is quite important, this year you received an internal audit report on housing, wholly owned companies governance review, in which there were 16 recommendations. We have participating in dealing with those recommendations. We have a clear governance action plan to deliver on those recommendations. And I think we're on target now to get those completed between now and early spring next year. So that should give additional assurance to the committee. So they're the three lines of assurance you can expect in terms of the activities going on within each of the companies. And I think it's over to Lorraine to really conclude our presentation and see if there's any questions from the committee.
Okay, thanks Shane. So the final slide just to wrap up. Hopefully that's given you a flavour of what the companies do and how they work. We've obviously been reviewing the companies. Shane mentioned the internal audit that was really helpful that we received at the start of this year. So we've been working up a plan to address those. And welcome to Shane, who's a new member of staff who joined us in September on an interim part-time basis forward again. So we're really clear about the company's purpose going forward, and just some parting conclusions really. We feel there's a really strong foundation for delivery now across the companies. So we've got the expertise and the financial strength, and there's real capability, which is what we've sort of set out just now about the opportunities for future growth, and importantly generating surpluses to flow back to the shareholder and BCP council. So real scope to build on what we've got, rather than setting up new entities. They are really good vehicles to push additional activities forward, and would absolutely want to continue supporting them through, for example, the company secretary role. So we've got that, and we've got Shane in post on an interim basis, and would really want to bottom out a term, and also the support that the council provides and pays for from the council to support the companies. So the final kind of next steps really is to mobilise that 5-year plan for the next 5 years. So that's probably it from us. We could probably talk for hours, but that's hopefully a summary, and would welcome any questions that anybody's got. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mealings, and thank you to Shane Egan for the presentation. So the intention of this, like many of the items that we're bringing forward other than the regular items for audit and governance, is to give members a wider range of understanding against the governance issues for BCP Council. So we thought that our wholly owned companies were a very good place to start. We're looking to do some work on outside bodies and some other areas, and as most of you will know, I have already come back to you in this last week or so to ask if there are any other items to add to our agenda in the months ahead, areas where we can look at the governance of other aspects of the council. So this is an opportunity just to get to grips with our subsidiaries and the holding company, and I think we will probably come back to these issues maybe in a year's time or whenever, but for members tonight, if there are any questions, please could you indicate? Vice Chairman.
So you mentioned right at the beginning there are a number of weaknesses in governance. What sort of areas are the weaknesses?
Okay, thanks, Councillor Williams. I'll probably defer to Shane in a moment, but there's some areas that we could develop in terms of scheme of delegation, for example, to make sure everybody's clear about roles and responsibilities, etc. It's that kind of activity. I think the bones of what we need are in place. And as Shane says, there's always areas of improvement. So Shane will probably remember more of the detail than me, but it's that kind of activity that we really need to tighten up. To make sure we've got clear reporting lines to the council, that Cabinet and council have got visibility of the companies probably more than they've got at the moment. Shane, is there anything else you wanted to add to that in terms of additional detail?
Yes, I think the key thing here is that the internal audit recommended 16 areas that we could act upon, and just to add to what Lorraine has reported upon. The other areas that are very important are key definition of risks within the company and good reporting on those risks. That includes a dedicated insurance program or a program that is fully aligned to our risks, and that's being developed at the moment. And then the other side of it is just making sure that there's good governance and good oversight on the key agreements between the companies and the council. So there's clear concepts of value for money within those agreements, but also there's clear duties and responsibilities in terms of reporting back to the shareholder and generally reporting openly in a good fashion for each of the companies.
Yeah, and I would just thanks, Shane, and I would just add to that in terms of the value that the internal audit did bring to those sorts of issues. It was really good getting a fresh set of eyes on what we felt was, okay governance. There's always room for improvement, so we're absolutely embracing those recommendations and taking them forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Williams has covered my first question, so thank you for that. So if I can move on to my second one, which is picking up on your expansion plans, really. I notice you're looking to increase the turnover and the profitability. What sort of competition is there out there for the work that you're doing? And are you operating in a relatively niche market when you're looking at provision for the homeless? And therefore, how easy is it going to be to actually meet those expansion plans?
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Yeah, an interesting question. I think in terms of the construction side of things, first of all, I think there is a wide market out there. So I think the team are at the moment looking at what the implementation plan would mean. It will involve probably additional recruitment of commercial skills to make sure we can tap into that market. But equally, we want to keep our local builders, etc., in business as well. So it's a careful balance. But I think there is potentially scope to move into some of that area. For the letting side of things, we are continuing to work with private landlords and encourage landlords to let their properties to people that come through our team as homeless. So we have an active landlord liaison service. We give out rent deposits to help landlords and tenants let their properties. But alongside that, we obviously moving into that space of letting our tenancies to homeless households. A lot of landlords, as you can imagine, are quite nervous about people that might come through the homelessness route and assumptions about their support needs and their ability to pay the rent, etc. We're willing to let to those households, and actually, they present no more risk than the next person coming along. So we will absolutely continue to work with the private landlords that are out there to get our households into those properties, but we'll do it ourselves as well. And I think there's plenty of scope to do more of that as well. Thank you.
Fine, thank you.
Councillor Phipps.
Hello, thanks. I noticed that, there's a proposed increase in turnover for Seascape, and that went through Cabinet in May 2020. Okay. BBML, there was talk of the business plan and mobilising, I think that was the word that was used, a business plan for the next 5 years. What's the status of that plan, and has it gone through any process within the council yet? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Phipps. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The seascape 5-year plan was tabled at Cabinet back in May and was approved. So that's the area of growth that we're working on pursuing. The business plan for BBML has not yet been ratified. Okay. So yeah, you haven't missed anything there. So what we are doing with BBML is kind of reviewing its existence, really, in terms of BCP. There's a bigger landscape now. BBML sits as part of a much wider operation where there are other delivery vehicles going on. So we're looking at sort of consolidating whether that is the way forward for the next 5 years. So we're taking a view on that. So we haven't quite got to the business plan part of that as yet. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I wondered if I'd missed it somewhere, so thank you very much. Yeah. But presumably that will come through the process and through the system in due course.
Absolutely, yeah. So BBML reports directly to Cabinet and Council. There's no group or anything like that. So yes, it will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nobody else has indicated that they wish to ask a question. So if I can just wrap this item up and thank both Lorraine Mealings and Shane Egan. I think it's been really useful to get the overarching governance issues into some kind of perspective for these companies, and gives us a better understanding of our remit as far as they're concerned. And I'm pleased actually that internal audit has identified the number of issues that need to be tidied up a little bit. And we look forward to hearing how those have gone through the companies, those who are directly involved, and through council, and no doubt ask you to come back to audit and governance at some stage in the future. So thank you both very much, and for the presentation. Could you also do as I think you already indicated and send the slides through to all members of the committee later? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.
Moving on now to item 7. Which is the report of the Constitution Review Working Group and proposed changes to the Council's constitution. The working group was reinvented to deal with items coming through, and we anticipate there will be more in the future. So it's a working group that is going to continue and will review other areas of the Constitution coming forward. I think I may have indicated that in the new year I'm intending to write again to all members of the council for suggestions as to what they would like to be considered and then taken forward if that seems the appropriate route. So the working group has 5 councillors from the Audit and Governance Committee. It's chaired by Councillor Lawrence Williams, vice-chaired by Councillor Daniel Butt, and the other councillors on this review have been Councillor Brooke and Councillor Cox, and I think Councillor Andrews attended for a meeting as a substitute as well. So my thanks to colleagues for doing that, because it's additional work and quite detailed work, and I think has thrown forward to us tonight quite a lot of business to take after this meeting through to full council. So thank you for doing that. We're joined this evening also by a number of officers, but for this particular item, Nick Perrins, who's the head of planning, together with Councillor Dave Kelsey, the chair of planning, and I may ask either or both of you for some input on the planning issues as we go forward. So going to the report and the various items that we need to look at and make recommendations on, I wondered if it might be helpful, if taking it in the order, if we could just deal first of all with the issue of the review of Procedure Rule 36. And this is an item which there was an email out earlier this week on Tuesday, I think, suggesting an alternative way forward. We do have Susan Zeiss on this meeting, who is the council's new monitoring officer, and this is really relevant to that part of our constitution. I wonder, Ms. Zeiss, could you just take us through your perspective on this and what is now proposed in the papers that came through in the supplementary bundle?
Certainly, Chairman. I actually asked Richard Jones if he wouldn't mind taking this particular matter up. I'm happy to come in on the planning call-in period. So if that's all right with you, Chair, Richard would be able to answer on this particular one.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Susan. Just to clarify as well a point, you mentioned the document going around on Tuesday. That was also published on the council's website, so it is available to the public to view. And it's really paragraph 5 in your main report just introduced the item. So the working group received some advice. I think one of their first meetings from the interim monitoring officer at the time. But I think it was useful to set out a little bit more detail for the rest of the committee and to suggest a couple of more recommendations for you to consider to perhaps recommend on to full council. So Procedure Rule 36 sits within Part 4 of the Constitution, which is the procedure rules, and it's within a general provisions section which applies to all committees, subcommittees and council. The current wording of that procedure rule is that any motion to vary or revoke these rules shall, when proposed and seconded, stand adjourned without discussion to the next ordinary meeting of the council. So I set out in the report, in the supplementary paper, two things really. One is that actually changes to the Constitution are actually a role and responsibility of full council itself. So to have it in the general provisions section of the Constitution isn't probably appropriate. It should be within the council procedure rules, not in the general provisions. And secondly, the effect of that rule has significant consequences of delay, in that when your recommendations come forward from the working group, having duly been debated and considered and due diligence, coming onto the Audit and Governance Committee and then recommending onto council, as soon as they are proposed and seconded at council, they would need to stand adjourn and wait until your next meeting of full council. So a little bit of an example of a timeline. You've been considering the current issues through September and October. You've come into Audit and Governance now on the 26th of November. Your recommendations will hit full council on the 5th of January, and any recommendations relating to procedure rules would then be automatically adjourned and then go to the 23rd of February, a 5-month delay, which I don't think is probably appropriate when some of these issues are important to get through. So the two recommendations are, however, I do highlight that whilst there may be appropriate times, perhaps if there was a motion through a notice of motion through Procedure Rule 12, which is where a member proposes something at full council to make a change to the Constitution, it may be appropriate at that point to have that adjourned to the following meeting so it can be fully considered. So there are two recommendations. One is that the wording of the recommendation limits the extent of that rule. So it's adding some words, and in the supplementary paper, I've got those set out, and the additional words are in italics. So the proposed amendment for that wording would be any motion, and then under Procedure Rule 12, motions on notice to vary or revoke these rules shall, when proposed and seconded, stand adjourned without discussion to the next ordinary meeting of the council. And the second recommendation is that Procedure Rule 36, as amended, if you agree to that, be moved to from the subpart C, so the general provisions, to the subpart A, which is in relation to council meetings only. I'm happy to answer any questions, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Members have been circulated on this, as I say. I've not had anybody indicate, so I would ask members of the committee, in terms of those two recommendations, which I certainly support, is there anybody who dissents from that? No, it doesn't appear so. So we'll take those two recommendations, Mr. Jones, we'll take those forward. Thank you for all the work that's been done on it. It's been a bit of a long and torturous process, but I think we're going to get there in the end. So the next item is member call-in of planning applications, and I think that we would benefit if we could go back to your earlier offer, Ms. Seiss, as far as I think it's items 12 and 13 in that report are concerned. Would you like perhaps to unpack some of that information for us, please?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Thank you very much. So when this arose initially at the working group at which I was present, there were some concerns that sparked in my mind about having an open-ended process for call-in by members of issues at Planning Committee. And that being that if there's no certain date for when that period ends, it may give uncertainty not only to the applicants, but also to planning officers to whom the delegation has been given the planning decision. And they may not know at what point they are able to issue the planning permission. So while members had expressed a concern that they didn't have enough time with the existing time limit of 30 days within which to make call-in, the legal advice is that it would be better to have a certainty of some sort. So whether there could be a compromise at, say, 35 days or so, I think that ought to be considered. Also, there is the other aspect of there is a time limit within which planning applications need to be made, and if call-in is open-ended, it may result in delays to the making of those planning decisions, inadvertently possibly, not intentionally, but I think that is a consequence that could follow. Is that sufficient for now, Chair, until we've discussed the whole item?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. And I'll either refer back to Mr. Perrins or to yourself, depending on whether it's a more sort of legal issue or whether it's a practical one in planning terms.
Indeed.
So, members, you've read the papers and those two additional paragraphs at 12 and 13, and we've got the two recommendations which follow that at 14. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Phipps.
Hello, thanks, Chairman. Previously, I've been quite involved in this call-in process, and it's always been a little bit controversial as to how long we should have and how it would work, and very, very difficult. I am totally in agreement with, I think, the monitoring officer. I think that's what she was saying, that we do need to have a cut-off date. You can't have an ad infinitum forever call-in. Everybody needs to know exactly what they're doing. Personally, I don't see why 30 days is a problem. That is a whole long time to call something in. All councillors are told, they are emailed with applications when they are registered. Everybody gets, the communication is there, and they then have 30 days. Now, if you want to increase it to 35, fine. I am quite sort of open to changing it. It isn't a problem for me, but there has to be a cut-off date as far as I'm concerned. You can't just leave this in midair, that anything can be called in at any time, because it's not just the original consultation you've got. Quite often what happens with planning applications, you have the original consultation, then there are amended plans, then you get another consultation. Where are you then? Do you have another 30 days, or is it still an ongoing from the first one? And I think this all needs clarifying. It's just not clear to me in the papers at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I have to disagree with Councillor Phipp on this one. From my own experiences back in Poole, the system without any deadline cut-off date worked perfectly well. The way it was approached was that you had, when you were aware of an application and you thought it was potentially controversial and that a red card may well be required, it would be discussed with the case officer initially, and then the red card had presented, and the proviso was, and we have got this facility available to us now, that when the case officer had come to a decision or was going to make the recommendation one way or the other, then they would contact the councillor, who then would decide whether he or she was going to keep the call in there or not. It could be removed if it was going the way that the call in was wanting it to go. One of the issues I have with the deadline date is that we've been receiving notification of planning applications in our weekly lists, some of which have actually been registered at least 6 or 7 weeks before we've actually received notification, in which case, if we have a deadline date, then there's no way that we can actually put in a call in, because that 35 days or 30 days or whatever deadline time has passed. And therefore, councillors are no longer able to operate in the way that they ought to be able to on behalf of their residents. So I'm afraid, having had experience over many years of a system that worked, to change to something that potentially is not going to work and deprives councillors of working as they should be able to, I can't go along with, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I'm going to next call Councillor Fear. Then I'm going to go to the Chair of Planning, followed by the Head of Planning, all of whom have indicated they wish to speak. So Councillor Fear, and then hopefully we'll manage to mop up all of these issues together.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, it's an interesting one, this, from what Councillor Phipps has said and Councillor Brooke. I see both sides of it, and I think there are some good points kind of across the board on this issue. I'm actually going through, there is one particular planning issue in my ward at the moment, and the disconnect is very visible to see, not just through applicant and council, but also through residents who may have views on an application near them, and I feel it's it doesn't at the moment strike the right note, and that's why I was very glad for you to say, Chairman, that the very wise Chairman of Planning is going to speak next, because I was wanting to get his thoughts on that, because he brings great gravity to this, and hopefully can steer us away forward. So I will let you move on to him, Chair. Thank you.
Well, as a former Chairman of Planning myself, I'm always happy to hear from the current incumbent. So Councillor Kelsey.
Thank you, Chairman. And Councillor Fear, I'll pay you that money later. Agreeing with Councillor Brooks on a lot of this. When we had the working group, Councillor Brooke and myself were very much in agreement about this situation. I do not see why we need to have a definite date. I do see, however, that having the call-in system is very incumbent on both officers and members working together, to the extent that once a call-in has been mentioned and the application and the officer has been speaking with the member, it's imperative that they continue to communicate with each other throughout the whole process. I think that is the most vital part of this. It may well be that if you were so inclined to put a date on it, that date should be after the officer has recommended what his decision is going to be. Once he's made his mind up about how he's going to recommend this to the planning board, then that should be the final time at which anyone can call an application in. There's no point an officer saying, yes, I'm going to recommend this for refusal, and then the member leaving it until 3 weeks or 2 weeks before the actual planning board date, and then saying, oh, I want to call that in. That's totally not right. But what the member should do is indicate to the officer that they are minded to call this in, and note the word I say, minded. That gives them the opportunity in discussions with the officer to withdraw that if they are minded to go along with the same recommendations. I do not see the point in wasting officers' time or members' time. And at the end of the day, we are here to serve the members of the public, and it is perfectly acceptable for them to continue to badger their ward ward councillors, even after such times as there may be some minor amendments to the scheme, and it will be up to the officer to notify the member of those minor amendments and as to whether or not it will affect his decision on the outcome of the application. So I think the only date should be within a couple of days of the officer notifying the member of his recommendation for that actual application. And I'll be interested to hear what Councillor Brooks thinks along those lines, Chairman. Thank you.
Turning now to the head of planning, Mr. Perrins. How can we get this to work and reach a position that we can all support?
Okay, thank you, Chair. I was just going to clarify points which Councillor Brooke mentioned about registration and when councillors are notified about planning applications. There's two different things. A planning application may be registered or valid behind the scenes at some point, but it's only the point at which the application is made public on the website or goes out on the weekly list for when the 30 days applies. So there shouldn't be any inherent issue with the 30 days in terms of when councillors are aware of the application, because they get issued on weekly lists, and the 30 days applies from that point at the moment. There used to be a problem in that regard where councillors were being timed out if it was delayed in the validation process, and that was changed in the last round of constitutional changes. I think I completely agree with what Councillor Kelsey is saying in terms of communication with officers, and I'd fully support that. I think what I would suggest is we need to have conversations as early as possible in the process in terms of when a councillor is minded to call it in, because if we haven't got that, and every officer then would have to contact a councillor without that discussion having taken place, it's going to take a lot of additional work for officers to do on every single application. So it comes back to this question about when should the councillors have the initial conversation with officers, and it comes back to the point about actually having some sort of time limit in the process to at least register the interest of a councillor, to have those conversations with the officer. And I would probably support at this stage, having heard the various discussions and advice from the monitoring officer, perhaps we go with 35 days, or suggest we try the 35 days, because that provides an extra 5 days from the current position. So there's a longer process for councillors to register the interest in the application of the officers, and allows time for the discussions to happen within. And if those discussions don't happen and there's no interest in the application, then the officer can then proceed and make a delegated decision and help ensure we meet our statutory targets. So I hope that's a helpful update at this stage, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perrins. Councillor Phipps, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've just been listening to all of this, and at the end of the day, I understand, and I do think we should, as councillors, have the opportunity to call in, the biggest opportunity we can to call something in. However, my concern is that the suggestion was made that you wait until the officer, you might register that you've got a bit of a problem with it and you're not sure how, you might be thinking of calling it in, but then you wait until until the officer has actually made a decision, and then you call it in. And this is going to prolong the process. And you have developers out there, or applicants out there, might just be an individual out there that is waiting for a decision. And the planning committee is quite busy, and then suddenly a report is done. The officer is minded to say, I refuse it, or I grant it, and you want to call it in. And then we've got another couple of months on top there before it actually gets to committee. And that is a concern for me. And I don't see why we can't have some sort of cut-off date. I still go with that. I'm sorry that some don't agree with that. But I do want the maximum time that we can have. I think 35 days is quite reasonable, but that's just my further thoughts on it, that what is being suggested by some might just prolong the process a bit too far. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Brooke, you wanted to come back as well.
Hi, thank you, Chair. Yes, I agreed with everything that Councillor Kelsey, he'd been agreeing with me on many of these issues. But Nick Perrins has raised the interesting point about the necessity for continued communication between the councillor and the case officer. I have to say that the way I've always worked it is that I try usually within a week to talk to or email my concerns to a case officer and make the point that I am mindful of calling the application in, and we usually discuss a time period within which to work in terms of getting that red card in or call in registered, and I've usually agreed to think it all over and submit it usually within 2 or 3 days of making the initial comment. And under those circumstances, you don't need to have a time limit at all. However, not all councillors work the same way when it comes to planning applications. So I might well be prepared to personally accept a 35-day limit, but that ought to be not necessarily the limit on which the red card is presented, but in which the discussion should have taken place with the case officer.
Thank you. Councillor Kelsey, you've got something further to add, I believe.
If I may, Chairman, thank you. I think what Councillor Brooks has just said is actually not a bad compromise on this, and that being if after 35 days there has been no contact from a member to an officer, then there should be no further availability for them to call something in if they have not already indicated that they may wish to do so. I think we have to bear in mind that when a yellow notice goes up, the members of the public get, I can't remember off the top of my head, either 21 or 28 days to make their representations. And it's also quite often that time when they will then contact their ward councillor and say, I want to make a representation on this. Can you think about supporting me? Can you call this in? So for then to members to only have 30 days, which by the way, when you take out weekends, can actually only be 20 days if you take out a 5-weekend month, for example, because there's no way of contacting people to talk to an officer on a Saturday or a Sunday. So that does only give the member a shorter period of time to deal with this. I think we must give the public as much time as is feasibly possible to do so, to speak to their councillors, and for the councillors, I emphasise again, it is imperative, and I totally agree with Mr. Perrins and with Councillor Brooks, that they must contact the planning officer at the earliest possible stage. We get these notifications at the moment, although they are on different days of the week. It'll be really good when we have it all as one system, so all 3 sets come out on a Thursday or Friday rather than a Thursday and a Monday, as it is at the moment. That will be really helpful. I know Mr. Perrins is doing some work on aligning everyone to get that sorted, and I'm really grateful for him for doing that. But I think we need to give each party as much time as they can possibly get, A, for the officers to get the reports sorted, and B, for members to get their indication of wanting to bring it to the planning board into the officers. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Could I just, there's one issue that I'd like Mr. Perrins perhaps just to address to us. I don't have any other speakers who've indicated. I wonder, Mr. Perrins, on the form that members have to complete to confirm that they've been in consultation with the case officer and they set out their various objections if they're calling in a planning application, or indeed their reasons for support if it's the other way about. There is the alternative at the end of that form for the withdrawal of that call-in, subject to the officer's recommendation. Could you just perhaps just run through that and see whether that has a part to play within this compromise, please?
Yes, of course, Chair. Let me just very quickly get the form up in front of me so I have the exact wording. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So there is a provision on the call-in form to have that that condition already in there. So all being well, the form can be filled in and it can be treated very much as a minded to situation already, actually. So I think having the 35 days, allowing a bit more time with the existing form, and perhaps we could have a look at the form just to check the wording to see whether we need to improve that wording any further. You know, maybe even have a minded to box, subject to discussion with legal services as to whether that's an appropriate constitutional approach to this. But yeah, perhaps this is the way around it, a 35-day period, so it's fixed in stone, so people know when to talk to officers and to register interest, and just to make sure that the form is therefore then flexible to allow discussions to continue throughout the process, but the officer knows when there's a potential call-in coming through the process. Would that sound a reasonable compromise?
Thank you. I think there is a need for some tidying up of that part of the form. And there's also, and this is more an IT issue, an issue about ticking boxes on there as well, which from my experience I've found doesn't always do what I ask it to do.
Okay, yeah.
And it's beyond my knowledge. So we've got two recommendations on this item, and subject to that consideration of that Ms. Seiss went through earlier, and I'll just quickly read them out. The first is that the Constitution be amended in Part 3, Section 2, Paragraph 2.2 to remove the 30-day time, sorry, 30-day time limit for member call-in of planning applications, although the requirement for there to be dialogue between councillor call-in of an application and the applicable planning officer be retained. And secondly, the protocol set out in Appendix 1 to this report be adopted. I'm getting the feeling that 35 days is the preferred period. I've certainly heard that from a number of people this evening. Are we able as a committee to support this recommendation, particularly given as explained by Mr. Perrins a moment ago? Is there anybody who dissents from that? Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I don't necessarily dissent. I just want to be absolutely clear. Are we then suggesting that it's 35 days and not 30? Just wanted to be clear, that's all.
Well, that was my suggestion,
yeah,
because a number of people have said they would support that.
Yeah, that would be fine by me, thank you.
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think it's a clarification as well in terms of that recommendation, because there's a difference between 35 days within which the red card has to be submitted and 35 days within which you are suggesting that you are mindful to submit. And that would need to be spelt out, I would have thought, in the Constitution.
So from a practical point of view, Mr. Perrins, following on from what you said a moment ago, how would you address that?
I personally think that the most straightforward way through this is just to amend the 30 days to 35 days within the Constitution. So the call-in has to be finalised within the 35 days, or any subsequent notification period which happens thereafter, which is already in the Constitution. But the form itself could have a minded to provision in there to register a very early interest, and then the officer can then follow up with the councillor if that call-in form hasn't arrived in its final form before the 35 days expires. So it's a basic combination of a fixed position in the Constitution to say 35 days for the final call-in to be received, or any subsequent notification period, but having a provision within the call-in form to have a minded to allow an early register of interest in the earliest stage of the planning application process.
And are you confident that case officers would have the time, resource and ability to ensure that process works in a fluid way to everybody's satisfaction? And I asked that question from a practical point of view, really.
Yes, planning officers are very busy, but generally when a form comes in, a call-in form, however it's submitted, even with a minded to provision within it, then they will follow that up. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I do want to try and wrap this one up because we've got a lot of business to get through tonight, but I've got two others who've now indicated. Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I'm still not sure about a 35-day time limit. Actually, I tend to agree with what Councillor Brooke said earlier on in the discussion, and also Councillor Kelsey, really, that in my experience in Poole, there was never particularly a problem, really. And I still am minded to just agree with the recommendation as in the report from the working group as it is, to remove the 30-day time limit and adopt the protocol set out in Appendix 1.
Councillor Kelsey, you wanted to come back.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry to be a bit of a pain on this one. Just one other sort of side question to this is, we have this 35-day limit that you are proposing now. What's going to happen? Is there going to be a limit as to when a member can then either withdraw that to give the officer time to either prepare a report for planning board or, to prepare to make a delegated decision? What I wouldn't want to see is suddenly a week before the hearing for a councillor to suddenly say, I don't need this to go to planning board now, because the chances are a member would have an officer would have already made a report out and spent a lot of time doing that for that reason. So I'm just wondering what Mr. Perrin's thoughts are on having a period when we have to make that, complete final decision whether we want it to carry on or be withdrawn.
Well, yes. I mean, at the moment, when the box is ticked, the call-in falls away, subject to the recommendation. That's very clear, and that works quite well. But yes, in terms of having a minded to position and when is the deadline for that going to work? It's a good question. I think it again comes down to, well, the whole process will have to be resolved within the 35 days. I mean, that's the overarching position. So I think it still comes down to if there's interest registered in the early stages on a minded to basis, but then that's not followed up within 35 days. We'll just need to make sure the officer has a contact with the councillor within the 35-day period. Otherwise, it wouldn't be registered as an official call-in request, if that makes sense.
Councillor Kelsey, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, my concern there, Chairman, is that will the officer have had a provisional decision within that 35-day period? Because if after 28 days that is the first time when the members of the public can no longer object, are you telling me that an officer will make a decision within 7 days, bearing in mind the amount of work that they are doing at this stage?
No, not at all. No. In reality, that won't happen. No.
So then, how is a member supposed to confirm whether or not he wishes to call that application indefinitely if he doesn't at that time know what the officer's decision is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, usually in a normal process, by 35 days, the officer will have an idea where the application is happening on an 8-week application. On a much larger application, the process can take longer. So what are you suggesting, Councillor Kelsey, in terms of how that might be resolved?
You just answered my question for me, Mr. President. On an 8-week application, I completely agree. By that time, the officer should have had an interim thought. But if we are dealing with a much larger application that has a much longer period, then that's where we're going to be out of time, aren't we? I mean, we all know how much work the officers have got on at the moment, and I fully appreciate that more than anybody. But I'm just very minded that sort of like 35 days will not have been enough time for them to probably even looked at the plans properly or gone back to the applicant and noted any amendments that may be making. And as we always know, quite often if an amendment is made, then it does reduce the need for a call-in, or it does make the call-in more necessary. I'm still minded to go with my original thoughts of not having a timescale on the call-in papers. I know that is going to cause a few problems, but I think it will actually solve more problems than it causes.
Anything to add to that, Mr. Perrins, to help us move this along?
Yes. Well, irrespective of the scale of the application, usually within the first 35 days, the original first notification period has happened. So there'd be a lot of interest on some applications, and that would be well known. And most ward councillors would probably also be contacted in the initial first 35 days at the very least. So I think the circumstances will be quite rare when a ward councillor doesn't want to call an application in within the first 35 days, irrespective of the scale of that application. That would be my sort of overarching view. You know, on a major application which has a longer time frame, the interest starts quite quickly. So most parties will be aware of when a potential call-in is coming. So I still feel a 35-day cut-off point, regardless of the scale of the application, will still work in practice. Is my view.
Am I right in taking it that larger applications, 13-week applications, are very likely to go to the planning committee in any case through other criteria, regardless of whether it's had a call-in from a ward member or not?
They're more likely, Chair, more likely, but not in every case. You know, some major applications don't warrant any interest, and therefore they don't trigger the 20 representation threshold. And whilst they're major applications, they're not contentious. So they're more likely to go, but not in every case.
Right, I've now got another 3 members who want to speak. I think I'd like to get to a vote as soon as we can, if that is necessary. I'd prefer not to, but if it is necessary, because we do need to get on with other business, frankly. So, Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I will be quick. I do have to agree with the officer, with Nick Perrins. At the end of the day, I just don't see the problem here. You've got a time limit, let's say 35 days, whatever, to call it in, and the form that you fill in says, if, for instance, if there's loads of objections, which there usually are within that time, you know, the public are usually straight on it. It says on the form, if the officer is minded to refuse the application, then you don't get it called in anyway. You know, it doesn't need to come to committee. So you sort of covered that point. So if they're going to refuse it, but it actually, if they want to grant it, for instance, because there's such a lot of objections, then it's coming to committee anyway. So I don't quite understand the problem here. I'm going with 35 days. That's the plan. So thanks. That's my thoughts on it anyway.
Councillor Fair.
Thank you, Chair. It's been a really good debate on this issue, and I completely understand where Councillor Phipps is coming from. The only downside is just how rigid it could be, and as the officer said, there could be rare occurrences where things could fall through the cracks, and that just worries me a little bit in the sense of the democratic side of the planning process. And that's why I'm kind of minded to go nearer to what Councillor Kelsey and Councillor Brooke and Councillor Brown have been saying on. And I don't know if there's any way of moving us towards that kind of position, because I think that would cover all bases then. And I think it would sit better not just with us, but obviously with full council when it's taken there. Thank you.
Well, I've got Councillor Brooke who'd like to come back, and then I'm going to return to Ms. Seiss as the monitoring officer, because I think that is contrary to what she was advising us earlier, but having heard the debate, she may have moderated that position. I have no way of knowing. So if I could go to Councillor Brooke.
Yes, Chair, and I was just simply going to say, if it helps, would we not, because we've got a recommendation at the first point, would the 35-day suggestion need to be proposed and seconded as an amendment? We vote on that, and if that falls, we then back to the substantive.
Yes.
it's our recommendation to do with what we wish, I suppose, at the end of the day. But thank you for that. Ms. Seiss, would you like to make any comment having heard the debate?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the opportunity. The point of raising this legal risk is the fact that it is a legal risk. It doesn't mean that either position is necessarily unlawful, but this would not have been tested in the courts by us. And I think the real risk is that, we have become a much greater authority since vesting day. We deal with a significant number of planning applications. Officers are, very busy, as we've heard. And I think there might be a risk. In fact, I think there's a clear risk of an officer inadvertently issuing a planning permission because they're simply unaware of the fact, for whatever reason, mistake or administrative error, unaware that a member has called a matter in. And there's no automatic right for an officer to recall a planning permission once issued. And I think that exposes the authority to the potential for either legal claims or local government ombudsman complaints. But it is a risk, and that's for members to balance which side of that risk they wish to fall on. I would still recommend from a legal point of view that it would be good to have a cut-off date, wherever you seek to put that.
Thank you very much. All right, well, in that case, I think everybody has had their say many times. We'll go to the recommendations from the working group. So those are from within Audit and Governance, and I've read them out already. I'll certainly, if you like, move those, but I think Councillor Brooke, you were indicating you'd prefer a more formal process of moving an amendment around the number of days. Am I correct?
Well, it was just a suggestion that might help clarify and help terminate the debate. I'm not going to propose an amendment myself.
All right, so we've got the recommendation on there, and we can go straight to the vote unless member wants to move an amendment to that, incorporating the 35 days, and we'll see whether it stands or falls. So if I move the recommendations that are on the table at the moment, could I have a seconder for those?
I'll second that, Councillor Beasley.
That was the Vice Chairman. All right, so we'll see where we go from there, because we've got to make a decision on this, and that's a good place to start. So it seems to me that we'll need to take a vote on that. Mr. Hanton, if we could, please.
Yes, Chairman. So just for clarification, we're voting on A and B together.
I think we will. Yes, I don't think anybody's going to dissent from that within the committee. So Chairman, I'll call out the names of the members in alphabetical order. So indicate if you're for, against, or if you're abstaining. Councillor Beasley. I'm for.
Councillor Brooke.
For.
Councillor Brown.
For.
Councillor Butt.
For.
Councillor Fear.
Abstain.
Councillor Filer.
For.
Councillor Phipps.
Abstain.
Councillor Williams.
For.
And Councillor Cox.
For.
Chairman,
that's carried.
That is carried. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That defined it, but I do believe, following what one or two members have said, that was a really useful debate, and I hope that we can all get behind this when we take it forward. Thank you very much, members. So the next item on this paper is the Neighbourhood Forum call-in of planning applications. And the working group recommendation was that the power to call in planning applications to committee should not be extended to neighbourhood forums. Is there anybody who wishes to speak against that recommendation from the working group? So can I take it we're all in agreement with that? Nobody has indicated. So that takes us on to the next item, which is the petition call-in of planning applications. And the recommendation from the working group was that the working group recommended that the call-in of planning applications on the receipt of a petition from local residents should not be added to the current process for call-in. Does anybody want to speak against that recommendation? No, so that is supported by the committee also. We then move on to the role of parish councils in relation to amended plans, and the working group recommended A, that the current arrangements for consultation with parish and town councils after a subsequent amendment be retained, and B, the protocol set out in Appendix 2 to this report be adopted. Does anybody want to speak against that? Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. It's not to speak against, but it is to suggest a slight amendment, if I may.
Certainly.
Insofar as neighbourhood forums are set up in areas where there are not town and parish councils, and once a neighbourhood forum has a made plan, it is actually a statutory consultee in the planning process, just like a town council or a parish council, and therefore to exclude neighbourhood forums with made plans from the notification of significant revisions to a plan, I think is unfair and discriminatory. So the amendment, it really would be to add neighbourhood forums with made plans to that, to town and parish councils.
Thank you. Mr. Perrins.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify that there is no exclusion to neighbourhood forums of plans. It was just, I think, the way the question was posed to the working party when it came forward, it just referenced parish councils. So the point of what is being suggested or proposed is that the current arrangements for notification on all applications for all interested parties is retained, albeit with a protocol for for how those re-notification processes are actually undertaken. So just to confirm that neighbourhood forums and groups would not be set aside from that process, they would be included within it.
So does that satisfy you, Councillor Brooke?
Yes, thank you. Oops. Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Nobody else has indicated, so I take it that we are in agreement on the item on the item at the recommendation 24. So moving on from there, the next one is the process for considering tree preservation orders, and the working group recommendation is that the tree preservation orders continue to be processed and determined at officer level and not be referred to the planning committee for determination. Does anybody want to speak against that? No, so I take it we're all in support there as well. Thank you. The next one is new planning committee structure, and the recommendation from the working group was that the current structure of the BCP Council Planning Committee system remain unchanged. Anybody want to speak against that recommendation? Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure that that is quite right, and I would like to abstain on this one, please, rather than vote for it. Thank you.
Any particular issue we should be considering on there, Councillor Phipps, from your perspective?
I'm expecting that the working group considered area committees. Is that correct? Rather than the current single structure of one committee for the whole of the BCP area. I don't think it's overly clear, but I'm thinking that that might be what was considered. And I'm not necessarily against that. So I'm not 100% on it, so I'm just thinking that I'd be best to abstain rather than vote for it.
Thank you. Cox.
Just to note that I will be voting against that because I strongly believe that we should be splitting the committee up into two, as I think I've already made clear, so I would need to vote against that. Thank you.
I think the genesis of this item may well have come from you anyway. Councillor Brooke.
Yes, despite seeing certain advantages in a single committee, I also see advantages in having the multiple area planning committees, and consequently I'm a sort of a split personality on this one and will abstain as a result.
Councillor Kelsey.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I would be best that we stick with the one committee, and I think today was a very good example of why. We had a very major application in Christchurch today that was dealt with. We had members that sit in Poole, Bournemouth and Christchurch all taking part in that. We had a 2-hour debate about that one application and we came to a consensus at the end of it, purely looking on planning terms. And that is what any planning board should do at any time. It should not matter where that particular councillor comes from as to whether or not they are able to make a decision on a planning application. I'm a great advocate that if you read your papers and you understand your local plans, you should be able to make a decision on any planning application. Therefore, I would strongly urge the working group, if I may, Chairman, to stick with what we have at the moment, which is one planning committee.
So nobody else has indicated. I've taken all the speakers on this so far. It would appear that we're probably going to have to go to a vote on this one. Councillor Cox, you've indicated again.
I just wanted to say that I was obviously present at the planning meeting this morning and congratulate Councillor Kelsey for a well-run meeting, and it was very thorough, as you quite rightly said. And it was done, in my opinion, on planning grounds, but I don't see any reason whatsoever that shouldn't be done in two committees rather than one. And so to imply otherwise, I think would be wrong. So that's just wanted to make that comment, that's all.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've heard a variety of views on this one. I think we do need to go to a vote. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Same procedure as last time. I go through in alphabetical order, and members can indicate whether they're for, against, or if they're abstaining the proposal at paragraph 31 in the report. Councillor Beasley.
For.
Councillor Brooke.
Abstain.
Councillor Brown.
Abstain.
Councillor Butt.
For.
Councillor Fear.
For.
Councillor Filer.
For.
Councillor Phipps.
Change of plan. Against.
Councillor Williams.
For.
And Councillor Cox.
Against.
Chairman, that's carried.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanton. Thank you, members. We've managed to get through the planning items. They were always going to be tricky for us. I knew that. They were for the working group too, actually. And we've managed to engage with each other across those where we've got differences. But I thank Councillor Kelsey very much for attending on these items, and also to thank Mr. Perrins for his input and his sage advice on one or two of these particular issues. Your contributions have been very welcome. I suspect that we'll be looking at some planning aspects again in the future, and you'll be very welcome to come back and join us. Councillor Kelsey?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity for my input to be put into the working group. And if you have no problems, I will now leave the meeting as it's been a very long day already.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Mr. Perrins, who's also had a long day, I'm sure.
Thank you, Chair. Thank
the final item that the working group looked at in this round is procedural, and it's the form of address for the person presiding at meetings. And the working group at 33 recommended A, no change be made to current practice and leave this as a matter of choice for each individual person presiding, and B, democratic services should ascertain in each case the preference of individual councillors as they are appointed. Does anybody differ from those two recommendations? No, it would appear not so. Councillor Filer?
I don't disagree, but I've just stressed that I don't like being called a chair, and I'm very happy to be called chairman or madam chairman or whatever, but I think it's an absolutely right decision that everybody has their own views and different people feel differently, and you can be very uncomfortable if you're chairing something called what you don't like being called. So that seems to be an excellent way to go about it.
Thank you very much. Well, nobody else has indicated, so I think I can take it that we are in support of those two recommendations. And actually, sorry, there is one further one, which is at 36. It's the appointment of substitutes for one agenda item only. And the working group's recommendation was that no change be made to current practice of substitution. Is anybody in disagreement with that? In that case, we agree that recommendation from the working group as well. That, I think, completes that particular item on the agenda. Thank you all very much for your contributions. And as I say, the working group will be reconvening to consider other items, I suspect on a periodic basis, particularly given any responses I get from members of the council looking forward into the new year. So moving on now to item 8 on the agenda, the Chief Internal Auditor's Annual Opinion Report 2019 to 2020. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. It's the first of 3 reports on the agenda tonight at 8, 9 and 10, which all align together and are set to provide you with the assurance you need to ultimately approve the statement of accounts at agenda item 11. In most material ways, my report is a summary or roundup of the reports that you've received as a committee through the quarters of the financial year 2019-20. So a lot of the content will be very familiar with those of you that have been on the committee during the year. My overall opinion is laid out in the executive summary or paragraph 5. But to summarise that, it's my opinion that the internal audit team complies with professional standards and we've completed sufficient and appropriate work to provide assurance on the adequacy and effectiveness of the council's internal control environment. I just want to draw a couple of items out, having reread the report today, if I may, Chairman. Paragraph 7, we talk about delivery of 87% of the audit plan, and on intuitive just consideration of that doesn't feel a tremendous achievement. In an audit world, we normally plan to deliver 90% of the agreed audit plan at the start of the year. That's because we expect about 10% variation in high level risks through the year. So we need to vary the audit plan through the year by about 10% in the normal world. And in this particular year, we had the COVID issue just kicking off around about February and March, and therefore that accounts for the further 3% of non-delivery of the original plan. Doesn't mean we were sat around only delivering 87%. We still delivered 100% of work, of course, but it's just 87% of the original plan. And finally, Chair, at paragraph 9, I just wanted to point out, 78 formal reports were issued with the various assurance opinions as detailed at Annex 1, sorry. And the table below paragraph 9 is a summary of the audits where we issued partial audit opinions with a very brief overview of why they were partial. But you have already received all that information through the course of the year in any case. And just for the avoidance of any doubt, there were no reports issued with minimal assurance for the 2019-20 financial year. Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Nigel. I got a number of comments on your report, but one thing I wanted to ask particularly was the any comments you had on the auditor's internal control recommendations, because they do seem to be quite fulsome and quite serious, and I have to say, particularly disappointed in the management response to those recommendations, or those highlighted weaknesses that they have in their report, because they seemed quite serious to me. So that was one particular thing. I have to say that if I, as I am in the audit profession, and if I had done 87%, I'd probably be struck off by now. But I completely appreciate what you're saying in terms of you do it. But I would imagine that when you're doing the work, that of the scheduled work you do, some of it's very serious and you actually have to do. And so I would have liked to have seen you say that you've done 100% of what you have to do, the really important stuff, like internal controls, for instance. So I think it might be worthwhile clarifying that. The other question I had is that if you look at your the detail of what happened during this year and what happened during the previous years, it struck me that there seems to be a gradual decline in the results of your opinions. So certainly in the last 2 years, the opinions have gone down in 5 instances and only up in 2. And that has been a gradual progress. Certainly between 17 and 18 and 18 and 19, it went down in 3 and only went up in 1. And in between the next 2 years, it was down in 2 and only up in 1. So there seems to be a decline in terms of the opinions that your team are offering, and therefore that would, whenever there's a trend, I start to worry, and therefore that there seems to be a trend whereby the internal control seems to be slipping, and certainly having read the external auditors' comments, it does provide me with some worry, shall we say.
Thank you, Councillor Cox, for those questions. If I tackle the easier of the questions first, which is the assurance that we are covering 100% of the key assurance elements that we look at, and draw your attention to Annex 1, where we are talking about the key assurance functions systems, and we've covered 100% of those that we originally planned to do. So absolute assurance that those items that are identified as key at the start, 100% covered in the financial year. With regard to your observation that the opinions are getting marginally worse, there's 2 contributory factors to that. One is, in the main, my team is obviously scarce resource, And what we are trying to do is increasingly so is spread that scarce resource as far as we can. And as soon as I'm confident that I can give reasonable assurance, I almost turn the audit off, because getting to substantial quite often requires extra audit work. And as long as we are content that matters are reasonable, we manage our audit resource in that way. The other factor, and this is more nuanced, is that the 1817-18 opinions were an amalgamation of our legacy councils, obviously, because BCP council didn't exist, and therefore what we tried to do there is the 1920 opinion is the first really of an amalgamated system, picking council, picking NDR, for example, which is one of the ones where you've noticed a decline. We've looked at the 3 NDR systems, and there are issues with bringing those together, and therefore there are some marginal differences in the overall opinion that are just inherent with bringing 3 systems into one. I hope that answers your question, Councillor Cox.
It sort of, yes, it does answer them, but it does give me another worry that you're short of resources, because we're a very big organisation now, and therefore, in my opinion, you should not be short of resources. You should have the full resources so that you can do the job in full. We should, to be honest, we should be aiming for substantial on most of the areas that you do, and so I have to say I'm quite concerned that that you have to, you sort of give up when you've got to reasonable, and I think, I'm not saying that's your problem. I think that's probably a political problem. But one of the other factors I did notice in terms of the units you were talking about was that in terms of the service unit audits and in terms of the key assurance functions audits, you only have partial down in the key one, the key assurance one, at 4 out of the 11, sort of 30% plus, you've only got partial. And in terms of the service units, you've got 10 out of the 38 that have got partial comments, I think. So those are quite large percentages in terms of where you've only got a partial opinion, considering that those are the key areas that we need to be looking at. So those are my only follow-up comments. Thank you.
Would you like to come back, Mr. Stannard?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Cox. On the first item, if I may, obviously I've got I'm a member of a professional institution, and I'm required to inform the council and inform the Section 151 officer if, in my professional judgment, I haven't got the resources to do the job that I'm set out to do, and I take that seriously. And I feel, with the the nuance of austerity and the scarce resources, that despite that, I do have adequate resource to give an adequate audit opinion, and I don't feel that that I am under resourced. I'm close to the bone, admittedly, but I'm not under resourced. If I can give you that assurance, Councillor Cox. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick question, really. I just noticed in paragraph 13, I think this is obviously what we've been referring to, there were actually, the number quoted is 517 recommendations. And obviously, I don't have a benchmark from a previous council. It's been mentioned about referring to the amalgamation of the 3 councils. How does that correspond with recommendations in previous years from the 3 councils put together? Have you got any idea, or is that something you wouldn't be able to tell me?
In all honesty, Councillor Phipps, I would need to go away and aggregate that. I know of Poole and Bournemouth numbers relatively accurately in my head, but I don't know the Christchurch numbers in my head. So I would need to go away, and perhaps I could supply that to you outside of the meeting.
Well, I'm not too worried. I just wondered how it corresponded. It's just that 517 seemed like a huge amount. It just seemed to me. I mean, you know, I don't know whether it is. Maybe it's kind of normal. And I just was wondering how it corresponded with the three previous councils. And I thought that might be relevant to how things were going. That was all. That's why I asked. So, yeah, I think it would be interesting to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Richards, Section 151 officer. Welcome.
Thank you, Councillor. Welcome and good evening to members. Can I just take the opportunity just to emphasise a small point, really, and that's the fact that there were 4 preceding authorities that will feed into the statement of accounts for BCP Council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richards. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. Picked up the slight downward trend, which really concerned me a little bit, especially since it was within the financial management sections. But what I'm more concerned about, and it's only one issue, in item 6, which I think is on page 36 of the report, there's reference to pool market and money collections, recording and banking. I seem to recollect, I don't know whether it was last year or 2 years ago, I picked up on this very item and it seems not to have changed. Now that to me is really quite worrying. Could you comment on that, please, Nigel?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Brooke. The issues that were raised in the last year of Poole Council were actioned. These are different issues, so it wasn't a case of officers not acting on audit recommendations, but obviously practices change and different auditors see different things, so they are different issues. Thank you.
If I may, Chair, it still has to be concerning that they appear to relate to the same items of collecting the money, of how it's banked, how it's recorded, and that lays itself open to all the other elements of risk relating to fraud and theft and so on. So it is an area that really does need to be tightened up as much as possible.
Mr. Stannard?
I agree with Councillor Brooke, and in terms of following through our actions, following up recommendations, sorry, we do that, as you know, as part of our follow-up, and we'll be on this one, no exception.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Nobody else has indicated that they wish to speak. This report is written, but in terms of the responses that we've received from Mr. Stannard, I know that he's also noted the comments from members as well. So report duly noted. That takes us on to item 9 on the agenda, which is the annual governance statement 2019-2020. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So the annual governance statement, I'm going to refer to it as AGS, if I may, from now on, AGS, AGS. So the AGS document is produced as a consequence of quite an extensive assurance gathering exercise, and that exercise is outlined in simple terms in paragraph 6. Some of the elements of that assurance gathering are permanent features, like the internal audit team. And others are one-off or year-end information gathering exercises, such as the management assurance statement, which is almost like a questionnaire of senior managers in effect. The AGS concludes for 2019-20 that BCP Council has effective and fit-for-purpose governance arrangements in place, and they are in accordance with our governance framework. Incidentally, the governance framework is appended at Appendix 2 and is obviously a live document. It is kept up to date as we go through the financial year and any year to align with the new processes and processes the council adopts. As you would expect in such a large, complex organisation like BCP, not everything is perfect, and so the annual governance statement seeks to highlight those areas where we have identified that we need to do more improvements to our governance processes. And there are four areas in this year's governance statement, and those are shown at 9 in the covering report. It is also important that we reflect on major issues that may impact on governance, but for whatever reason we determine don't need to feature on the annual governance statement, and explain why. So paragraphs 13 and 14 of the covering report identify COVID-19 impact, for example, and legacy council arrangement as 2 examples of those issues. Turning back to the 4 governance issues, if I may, Chair, we've identified as requiring improvement. I just want to briefly talk about the 4th one of those, if I may. So councillors may recall that this issue, namely the omission to make available for public inspection the draft AGs in June 2019, that was subject to the monitoring officer producing a Section 5 report of the Local Government and Housing Act to full council in September this year. This type of report is required where the monitoring officer ascertains that the council has failed to follow certain legislation. Council were told that the matter would also be recorded on the AGs this year to transparently and fully report on the matter for this financial year. And at council, at least 2 councillors expressed an opinion that the phrase minor omission did not necessarily reflect the issues in the monitoring officer's report. In the AGs as it stands presented tonight, I've used that same language to reflect what council was presented with back in September. But if Audit and Governance agrees with the comments of the 2 councillors at council and wish to remove the word minor, we could do so before you ask the chief executive and the leader to sign the annual governance statement off on behalf of the council. And from an officer perspective, the issues have already been dealt with. The AGs for this year has been made available during the inspection period. So this is purely a preferred wording issue for the annual governance statement. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. If I could just perhaps add to that 4th point, mainly for the benefit of those members who are new to the committee, so that you understand where we are on this. So Mr. Stannard has referred to the first of the 2 recommendations that we'll be considering in a moment. What he's referring to is that the wording used by the then monitoring officer at council back in September was a minor omission, and council agreed to refer this to this report to the of the annual governance statement that's before us this evening. Now, obviously, we can't alter what's been said previously, but we can alter the wording and adjust it at this point if that is the view that the committee would like to pursue. And the suggestion made is that if it was something the committee wanted to do, we could remove the word minor and just have the word omission instead. And that will be something to consider at the first of the 2 recommendations presently. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, speaking as one of those 2 councillors, I will strongly recommend to the committee that we do remove the word minor. it was a breach of effectively law, and therefore any breach, no matter how much people think may be not very serious, is still a breach, and therefore I think it would added insult to injury that we described it as a minor omission, particularly when the individual concerned went through hell and high water to highlight this issue to the council, and he was quite regularly ignored, and so therefore I think we should remove the word minor, because it's any breach of the law is not minor, and we should actually just call it an omission, and maybe even add the word serious, but that's probably over-egging it, but I think any breach of the law should be taken seriously. That would be my comment.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. I don't have any other speakers, so Councillor Phipps, you've now indicated.
Yeah, sorry, I was getting my cursor to the hand. Really, just a couple of comments, really, or a comment. In their report, there's a couple of things I was just going to say comment on. One is at 10 that it looks like one of the issues that was taken over from the Legacy Council was the issue of Children's Social Services taken over from Bournemouth, and I'm really pleased that significant progress has been made, as it says on that, for improvement, and that is good news. And some more good news is at 13 on the impact of COVID, where it certainly at A, it says that the council swiftly implemented robust governance arrangements to manage the impacts of the epidemic. And I think actually this council and the administration of the time should be complimented for that, because this was thrown at us, this COVID, it just appeared. It was never expected. It was, you know, a huge surprise, and we had to deal with it swiftly and quickly. And obviously the report reflects that we did so in a very efficient manner, and I think that should be noted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Phipps. Councillor Cox, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, sorry, I was just commenting really on the point that Nigel had raised in terms of the minor. I do have a few other points, if I can raise those, if that's all right. I'd just like an explanation in terms of paragraph 11, where you talk about adjustments to the highways register. I was particularly puzzled as to what exactly that related to. The other, I would echo what Councillor Phipps was just talking about, because in terms of 13A, it's quite clear in the auditor's report and recommendations that they also highlighted the swift way in which the administration at the time was dealt with the COVID-19. And then the other couple of points I had was in terms of 13B. I was slightly concerned with the last statement that the council remains focused on introducing BCP specific policies. Maybe I'm getting cynical in my old age, but I sort of I translated that as to be it's on the back burner, as not to be important. But you know, I think if you want to do it, you have to have an action plan, and they have to have an end date as to when these things should be completely standardised. The other points I'd like to make in terms of 14B, the localised incidents of fraud, I'd like to see what these reported, particularly to this committee, on a regular basis, where these have occurred, and explanations. I previously sat on an audit and governance committee of a technical college, and every committee we had, it was there every month where there was a fraud. Quite often there was nothing to report, but where there had been incidences of fraud, it was reported to that committee, and I thought that was important. So that was the other things I wanted to comment on. Thank you.
Councillor Cox. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So starting with the point about the highway layer, that there's a statutory process to go through. It's called a stopping up order, where if you take areas of land off the highway layer, you have to go through a formal process which is called a stopping up order, and it involves public consultation with relevant parties around that pocket of land that you may be taking off the highway status. So, for example, there may be strips of green or concrete next to highways that are sold off, for example. So that has to go through a formal process. And the issue in this AGS identification area is that for one of those issues in the financial year 2019, we didn't go through that correct process for one area of land. And then on the issue of localized incidents of fraud, Councillor Cox, we do an annual report, which actually this committee received at its last meeting in October. And depending on views, we could quite easily bring that to be a quarterly meeting. I could add it to my internal audit quarterly report, and I could add a section in and then consolidate on an annual basis. I have no problem with that. And happy to take councillors' views on how they would want to do that. I think the only matter of process that we might need to think about is that quite often fraud has a long tail to, and we wouldn't want to prejudice any investigation or police activity, and we might have to go into private session quite a lot if we had quarterly reporting. So that would be my only observation.
Could we perhaps ask you to look at that proposal and come back to us with something once you've had time to consider it and firmed up, perhaps at our next meeting, because I think you ought to also be considering the resource implications and the practical implications as well. So I think perhaps if you could come back to us at our next regular meeting, not one of the special ones, but our next regular meeting, I suspect that may well satisfy Councillor Cox's concerns. Would that suit you, Councillor Cox?
Yes, that'd be good. But I do feel as though that if a small technical college in London can do this, then I don't see any reason why BCP can't.
No, I think you're pushing in an open door, actually. So we'll wait for Mr. Stannard to come back, if we may. Now, nobody else has indicated. Looking at the recommendations and bearing in mind the comments that were made earlier on, I'm wondering, Councillor Cox, whether you have worked up any additional wording that we might use to amend the first recommendation along the lines of changing this from a minor omission to just an omission. Sorry, an omission. If you would prepare to do that, I'd certainly support you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I haven't worked up any particular words, but what you just said seemed perfectly good to me.
I didn't write them down, but I'm sure the officers have. So the two recommendations, which I will read out, the first one is the one to which we need to add that proviso of removing the word minor. And it says the annual governance statement 2019-20 for BCP Council is approved and the leader and chief executive are asked to formally sign it. And B, that the BCP action plan to address significant governance issues is approved and a progress update will be presented to Audit and Governance Committee in January 2021. So subject to that additional wording suggested by Councillor Cox. Is everybody going to be supportive of that? Anybody disagree with that? No. Mr. Stannard, that is the recommendation and agreement of Audit and Governance to your annual governance statement. Could I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for all the work you've put into both the annual opinion report and the annual governance statement. A huge amount of work in there, and that is appreciated by the committee, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of all members in support of that. Takes us to item 10 on the agenda, which is the external audit findings report for 2019-2020, and we have with us from Grant Thornton our external auditors, Paul Dossett and Sam Harding. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Sam, in a minute, I thought it'd be useful to sort of perhaps reiterate what I said at the last meeting. The pandemic has made the auditing in a pandemic very challenging. BCP's audit is doubly challenging because of the impact of local government reorganisation. And just to give the committee an update as to where we are nationally, 4 days before the statutory deadline. As of this evening, we were sitting at 20% of our audits signed. We have been informed that that's very, very similar with the other firms in the sector. So I think that just reflects exactly where we are in this environment at the moment. But Sam will then take us through the specifics of our report, and obviously we'll be happy to take questions from members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dossett.
Thank you. So this is our interim audit findings report. We would normally have been expecting to sort of give our final report and allow you to confidently sign off the accounts at the end at the end of this meeting. However, for the reasons that Paul has explained, really the impact of COVID and the complexity of the accounts arising from the LGR process means that we are not in a position to be able to sort of give our final opinion and our view on the financial statements. So this report sort of sets out where we are at the moment and the work that we've completed. So we have undertaken a significant amount of our work. However, there are still some areas that we have yet to complete. So those are particularly around the property, plant and equipment, and also around sort of some of the assurances that we need on the pensions liability. And we're also waiting for the results of the work that's being undertaken on the Dorset Pension Fund to enable us to complete that. I'd probably like to draw your attention really to the findings that we have to date. I can take you to the adjustments that we've made to the accounts. So those are on our page 39. I'm afraid it is a rather long report. The findings that we have currently are just a movement around the pension interest, which has impacted on some of the disclosure of the figures within the comprehensive income and expenditure statement, but not affected the bottom line. Our work on property, plant and equipment to date has identified an error in the treatment of capital expenditure incurred on land and buildings that have been revalued in the year, which was added to the revalued amount. So that has been written back, and we're still working through the accounting entries just to make sure that those are correct. The disclosure items that we found really relate in the main to sort of some of the expenditure and funding analysis, which is what we need to pick our samples. So we made quite a number of adjustments within that note, although those won't at the moment impact on the general fund. That has delayed our ability to pick samples, which has also in part sort of contributed to the reason that we're not in a position to sort of finalise the audit at this date. And I think Councillor Cox may have alluded to some of the findings that we had around the internal control issues. The main ones we found really relate to the complexity of the financial systems. As clearly it's been a difficult job for the council to bring all of its accounts together. So it's still operating a number of legacy systems, and in very various ways those tend to operate fairly independently. So that has sort of created a lot more complexity in the ability to pick samples and check reconciliations. We understand that the Council's transformation programme is working to address those issues, but it does need to progress at pace, because otherwise the issues that we're identifying in this audit this year will probably continue into the following year's audit, adding to the complexity and the time it takes us to complete the audit. So additions to the capital programme, I think that the capital programme and the fixed asset registers are quite complex. So there are 3 fixed asset registers that the council's running at the moment, one for each of the council houses, and then one general fund one. I think it's difficulties we've experienced really, I think, is obtaining up-to-date figures for the capitalised work to ensure that those are written back correctly once the valuation work is done. The valuation work has also been quite complicated because the council at the moment is employing 5 valuers. And I think, as we explained sort of in our previous reports and last year, the level of work that we have to do to satisfy our regulators regarding the valuation of property, plant and equipment is quite complex and quite onerous. And obviously that is compounded by having to review the work of 5 different valuers and make our get our assurances in respect of them. We have engaged an internal valuation expert who is assisting us in this programme, and he is looking in a bit more detail at some of the larger valuations of the larger investment properties and other assets, and we will report back on his findings in our next iteration of this report. And that is also sort of similar issue with the Poole Neighbourhood Fixed Asset Register, where there were some difficulties in reconciling. That's sort of carried out by PHP, so it's a little bit separate from the council, but we do understand that they're probably going to bring the whole reconciliation programme within house, which should make that easier for next year. Our other major findings from the accounts really are to do with the IT systems, and we've added those in an additional Appendix D. We employ our own sort of IT auditors, and they have come in and done a thorough review of your Oracle Fusion, and they have a number of observations and management responses, which I wasn't going to take you through in detail. Hopefully they're probably fairly technical, so any queries, please let me know. I think finally I probably really want to highlight where we are in our value for money work. As has been said before, we congratulate the council on how well it's addressed the COVID issues, and it was one of the quickest to respond. But obviously that has taken a lot of sort of officer time in constantly looking at the budget and also sort of managing the impact of COVID and sort of enacting all of the government's policies and requirements in the area. So the council has done well with that, and it also has done well in obtaining its outturn position. Although we would like to stress really that the council did start with reasonable reserves, but it's not as reserve rich as many of its other similar councils. And we understand that there is a sort of a comprehensive transformation programme ongoing. However, the council will need to be aware that things like COVID really do bring into stark focus the need to keep a good level of reserves, and bear that in mind with its investment policies going forward. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Harding. Are there any questions from members? Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you, Sam, for that run through, which is very interesting. I think last year I was a bit critical of you from memory, and I just want to pay compliments to you this year, so don't fall down. I thought your report was excellent. Actually, I thought it was a very thorough report and highlighted a lot of interesting issues. I have one it's a very minor point, but I think it was on page 40, where you seem to be complaining about over disclosure, and I think you called it partial in terms of adjusted. I never complain about over disclosure. I think over disclosure is a good thing, particularly for a council. So I would pull you up on that one in particular. The only thing I would like to add to what you were just from what you were just saying is in terms of the areas where you struggled with, and I was in terms of the property, plant and equipment. Could that not, I know you complained that was part of the reasons why you can't sign off now, but could that not have been done prior, earlier? Because obviously that's that's a fairly fixed item. There's not much changes. I would imagine, and I think we actually highlighted this area last year as an area that you should be looking at earlier. And so, you know, I was a bit, what's the word? I didn't entirely buy the argument when you said it. However, having listened to you just then, I can understand, particularly with the adjustments that you've made for the capitalisation items, then that would cause problems. So I can understand it from that item. But I don't know, in future, maybe that these items that you know, we know about early could be audited in an interim of some description, certainly the property side, and also the pensions. I would imagine that those go through all the way through the year, and therefore I wouldn't imagine that we should be waiting at the end of the year as for the final items. Those were really the two items I wanted to highlight. But I would reiterate, I did find your report very good, and I was particularly keen and pleased. Not pleased is the wrong word, but impressed to see the internal controls sheet you've got, and I thought, you know, I would commend your auditors, your team in terms of that. I think that was very thorough and very useful for the council. But I would, I think I already mentioned to Nigel, I wasn't that keen on the management responses, and I felt that they could have been more robust in terms of how they're going to deal with them in the future. But those are my only comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Just on the particular 2 points about property and pensions, we do some work. We've done a walkthrough of those systems because they are a part of our significant risk areas. The problem we face is that we're reliant on other parties, essentially valuers for property and actuaries for pensions, to provide us with the numbers that we then audit, and we don't receive those during the year. We don't receive those until after the year, and particularly on the asset valuation issues, and as Sam described, the various complexities of yours. Coming back to my earlier point about, you know, only 20% have been signed off. Of the other 80%, about 75% at least are potentially missing the deadline because of property valuation issues. It's the most complex thing that we do in these audits, and therefore that's why we are where we are. And you're just, as Sam described, the 5 valuers and the 3 asset registers. You know, we can do some preliminary work, and we have, but we have to wait for the final valuations to settle down to start our work on those.
Yeah, we did start our work on both of those areas in August. We are struggling a little to get some of the supporting information that makes up those valuation reports, such as things like floor plans. On the pensions front, as you said, we have done the majority of our work on that, but we're also reliant, because we are not the auditors of Dorset Pension Fund. There are a number of tests that the pension fund auditors do that we would rely on for our opinion, and also we need to follow up on any queries that might be specific to BCP that they have as a result of their work. All pension fund audits have been particularly complicated this year because it's the year of the triennial review. The valuation issues around material uncertainties due to COVID have impacted quite significantly on the valuation of pension fund assets, and there's also been a number of sort of fallout from the McLeod issue that you may remember last year, the Goodwin issue, and also material uncertainties in some of the pension asset valuations and derivatives. So we can't really complete that pensions work, although the majority of it is complete until we receive those assurances from the Dorset Pension Fund.
Did you want to don't mind, Mr. Chair, can I just come back, if you don't mind? In terms of the properties, I'm interested to hear what you're saying about properties in terms of waiting for valuations to be firmed up. Certainly my experience of trying to get valuations from chartered surveyors at the year end is actually nigh on impossible. They've thrown their hands in the air and said, we don't know what's going on out there. I'm delighted that you're actually getting some firm responses from valuers, because the ones that I've come across have thrown their hands up in the air because given what's been going on, they're not prepared to say. And we've had to, certainly my firm have had to report accordingly that that nothing has changed, which is quite interesting in terms of the accounts, because you have revalued some items in the accounts. I'm assuming those have been done from the old legacy as a, what's the word, an accounting harmonisation, an accounting policy harmonisation between the three councils, and you've had to do it for that reason. But I'd be interested in your comment on that. Thank you.
Mr. Dossett.
Yes, so I think the issue there is, what the valuers were, all valuers across the country were able to give us reports as of the 31st of March. They all had effectively had the COVID-19 material uncertainty emphasis, material uncertainty disclosure in their reports, which the RICS had recommended that they include. So they were able to do that based on them, but that effectively doesn't take COVID into account at all. It just says COVID is here. It creates an uncertainty. We'll put that paragraph in our report, and we'll just value it as if nothing else, as if that hasn't happened, based on their existing processes. And we spoke to some valuers, including the valuers we use to support us in our work, and they were very clear that it doesn't matter what COVID did or didn't, how it did or didn't impact subsequently on the property market. They were doing it their view at the 31st of March, and they were sticking to that view, and that's what's happened here. So the movement from prior year sort of combined figures is not exceptional, but it's just getting underneath some of those valuations and why they've reached them that's been the challenge. You've got lots of investment properties as well, which are quite complex to understand as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dossett. Councillor Phipps.
Hello. Pressing the buttons here. Okay, well, I just wanted to make a comment, really. I want to say something nice. At the end of the day, if you look in the report under value for money, the overall conclusion, the overall view is BCP Council has managed its first year of existence in an effective manner, and throughout has been focused on ensuring its financial sustainability. Council reacted quickly to COVID-19 pandemic and has spent a significant time focusing on measures to achieve financial sustainability. And basically, I think that is a testament to the sound and effective way this completely new council has been managed in the past year, and also with competent and very sound advice from officers who've played a huge part in it all and done such a lot of work. So there were huge challenges to be faced, considering it was a brand new council and with the COVID coming upon us. So I just want to say, I think actually jolly good job all round, and everybody should give themselves a pat on the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, nobody else has indicated, so we're asked to note the report, which we will duly do. Could I just take this opportunity to thank Mr. Dossett and Ms Harding from Grant Thornton for their ongoing work. Apologies that you're towards the end of the agenda and have to wait for so long, but your report is very much appreciated by the committee. So moving on to item 11, and officers who've had to wait even longer, the Statement of Accounts 2019-2020, and I'm going to ask Mr. Richins, who's the Chief Finance Officer and Director of Finance for BCP, together with Mr. Povey, who's the Assistant Chief Financial Officer. Would you like to present to the committee? Mr. Richins.
Thank you, Chair, and I think Councillor Phillips will see. But can I just start by saying it is a pleasure to introduce this report, which presents the first ever annual accounts of BCP Council for the consideration and approval by the Audit and Governance Committee. In undertaking your considerations, can I take a moment to highlight that this has been an exceptional year in terms of compiling, auditing and approving the BCP Statement of Accounts for 1920 due to a number of factors. As the first year of the existence of BCP Council, the accounts have been incredibly complex to compile and to audit. The accounts include opening balances from 4 legacy councils, and we have had to place reliance upon a number of financial systems inherited from those predecessor authorities. The second factor is the COVID-19 public health emergency, which has impacted on both the complexity and the efficiency of the audit. This report includes the fact that the accounts include many estimates and valuations that are inherently more uncertain due to the financial consequences of the pandemic, and so require more audit work to gain assurance of their validity. In addition, remote working has affected the efficiency with which the audit can be completed, and the significant amount of work that the finance team has had to undertake in order to support the council's response to the pandemic, including assessing the financial impact of the pandemic on the council's budget, which will inevitably impact on their ability to respond to audit queries swiftly. These factors must also be considered against the backdrop of increased audit assurance work auditors are being required to undertake nationally in respect of both the asset valuations and the pension valuations. In an attempt to recognise the consequences of the pandemic, and as an exception for 1920, the deadline for approving the statement of accounts as mandated in the audit and accounts regulations was put back from the end of July to the 30th of November. While the work of the auditor is substantially underway and the Grant Thorntons expect to issue an unqualified audit opinion, the audit opinion will not be issued by the 30th of November deadline for the reasons I have already outlined. Therefore, Audit and Governance Committee are asked to approve the draft statements as included as an appendix to this report, with any further material changes as a result of the remaining audit work being reported back to the January Audit and Governance Committee with further approval sought if required. The Audit and Governance Committee are also asked to approve the signing of the Statement of Responsibilities and the letter of representation by the committee chair once the audit work is complete. In order to comply with the requirements of the accounting audit regulations, a notice of delayed audit opinion will be published on the council's website. Chair, I will now pass you over to Dan Povey, the Assistant Chief Financial Officer, who will briefly go through some of the main features of the statements accounts as presented today. And we also have Matt Filmer, Finance Manager, on hand to answer any detailed questions on the financial statements. Clearly, this will be further to the informal workshop on the 1920 accounts that were provided by Matt and Dan to the committee members on the 12th of November. So at this point, Dan, would you like to take over?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Good evening, members of Audit and Governance. So I'm just going to go through some of the main features of the accounts, probably in quite a brief manner. We went through in some detail, as Adam has said, in the budget workshop. But what I'll say, I'm going to share my screen and just go through, I think, four of the statements. But in essence, the accounts have to be produced in what's in accordance with UK accounting practice, which includes the SIPFA Code of Practice for local authorities, international financial reporting standards, and so on. And what that does is it gives you the true economic cost, the accounting cost of the council providing its services. But it does include certain items that we don't actually have to fund, but they're like paper accounting entries, if you like, and they don't hit our bottom line, our general fund. I'm talking about things like depreciation, certain asset pension current cost adjustments, and some of the asset valuations that go through the income and expenditure account. So what we have to do is reverse all of them out to get to our true position. And what that does, two things: it makes the accounts incredibly long, but also incredibly complex. So what I'll try and do is just try and point out what I think are the main bits to look out at. So if you could please tell me when you can see what hopefully will say narrative report on it.
We can see it now, Dan.
Right, perfect. Thank you. So I think if there's one area of the accounts that a reader would go to understand the financial position of the council, they'd read the narrative report, if I'm honest. It's a one-stop shop in hopefully plain English, affecting the council's financial position, covers revenue, capital, areas of financial risk and corporate priorities. So I won't go in detail into what's actually in it, but it covers things like the outturn that we reported to Cabinet in July, which was a 0.2 million surplus on the financial year. That was our funding position, our true bottom line position. It goes and talks about the medium-term financial plan, the effects of COVID-19, of course, and corporate priorities such as the transformation programme and accommodation and estates programme. In terms of the statements that you're considering tonight, hopefully you can see comprehensive income and expenditure statement has flashed up. Yeah, so this really is that accounting position, the economic position of the cost of providing council services. And you'll remember I just said what we reported to Cabinet was a 0.2 million surplus. When you've added in all of that depreciation and pension adjustments and the like, we go to a 99.1 million deficit. So it gives you an idea of the scale of accounting adjustments we have to put through the accounts. The other thing just to point out is once we've made some, added in some basically balance sheet items on asset valuations, we get a total comprehensive income and expenditure figure of income of 6.7 million. What that figure is, that's quite an important one. That is the increase in the net worth of BCP Council since its first day on the 1st of April 19 to the end of the financial year on the 31st of March 20. So when all is said and done, the balance sheet has gone up by 6.7 million. So that's probably the most interesting figure really on that income and expenditure account. So hopefully the movement in reserve statement has now come up in front of your eyes. This is really how all of the reserves that the council has at its disposal, which are in the balance sheet, have changed over the financial year. Now, the interesting bit are the first 6 or 7 columns. There are usable reserves. They're the things that we can use to finance expenditure. So you've got the general fund, which is our rainy day risk money. Our earmark reserves, which are for specific approved corporate projects or financial resilience reserves, housing revenue account, and basically some capital reserves. What you'll see in this, and hopefully you can see the figure, it has the figure of the deficit we made in the year on the income and expenditure account, the 99 million. And you can see we reverse out 100 million of accounting adjustments. And that gets you to what actually happened to our usable reserves in the year was they increased by 1.2 million. You know, so it just shows you how much is going on in the accounts that doesn't affect our funding position. So that's good news. The first year, the balance sheet went up by 6.7 million in total, but our usable reserves also went up by 1.2 million. And what you see is where that 100 million was reversed out to was what we call unusable reserves, which are basically accounting sink pots, if you like, largely for capital transactions, for capital financing and capital revaluations. So that just gives you an idea of what the true position was. We increased reserves. Chairman, the last statement I would just draw members' attention to is the balance sheet itself. This is the most useful actual statement within the accounts because it isn't really clouded by too much in the way of accounting adjustments. The first thing members will see, we've got an asset base of 1.7 billion. That is all of our housing properties, our investment properties, all of our community centres, you name it. We've got an asset base of 1.7 million. So we are a large council. The second thing I will draw your attention to, if I can, is our debt. If you added up our long-term borrowing and our short-term borrowing, we've basically got borrowing of about £270 million. Now, when you look at our capital financing requirement, which is the amount of assets we've bought or funded, we could have borrowing of over 440 million. So we are significantly under borrowed against the amount of assets we have built or purchased. And that is because in these days of low investment income, but relatively higher borrowing costs, we have used our internal cash balances to fund that capital investment. That position is kept under review, but it's proved very cost effective for the council over time, and for the legacy councils, of course. Probably just two more things to point out, Chairman. The pension liability, we've got a liability there of 763 million. Obviously, if we didn't have that, the net worth of the council would be a lot greater. I would say that is an accounting liability. The pension fund itself at the beginning of the financial year was 92% funded. That did fall at the end of the financial year to about 85% due to the effect of COVID-19 on the stock market. But this isn't the actual position. This is an accounting position, and you'll see it's matched by an equal and opposite negative reserve in unusable reserves. But nonetheless, it takes our net worth of the council down to £687 million. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what probably the main things are in the accounts, Chairman. I'll stop there and then perhaps invite any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Huge amount of this in the workshop 2 weeks ago, and I was very pleased with the attendance at that workshop in order to make sure that we had a proper grounding in the issues around the statement of accounts. Councillor Cox.
Yeah, sorry. Obviously, I wasn't at the workshop, but sorry if I'm asking questions that you've already answered. Then excuse me. Well, first of all, well done to Adam and Dan and the team, because I know from bitter experience this is a huge task, and I have to say that you, according to the auditors, you sent in the accounts earlier than was required. So that is an achievement in itself, to be honest, given the circumstances. I've got a few things I just wanted to either comment on or ask questions on. So if you just excuse me, in terms the narrative report, that's effectively the director's report, isn't it? You know, it's the report, or trustees report, whatever you want to call it. So that's quite as Dan quite rightly said, that's quite an important document. And I would just highlight the fact that that there was a surplus of £0.2 million. And that was despite the fact that there was COVID costs of £3.5 million, which was taken on the chin without any funding from central government. So that was quite an achievement, as well as, of course, adding £2.7 million to the resilience reserve. So I think that the whole team needs to be complimented for that. One question I had was in terms of, I think it's page 14. If you just go to page 14, I think it talks about, and it's the third paragraph from the bottom. It talks about the challenges of funding one-off assets. Now, my understanding is that paragraph will have changed given the change of administration, because there's certainly been a bigger focus on borrowing from the current administration, and therefore that paragraph may well be redundant, and you may want to think about that again and add in a change of sorts. So I'm just highlighting that for you. In terms of, just go to the accounts now. And I've got a few comments. On going back to that narrative report, one issue I do have with it, I'm afraid, is your tables. All of the figures are centered. All the figures are centered. I find centering figures, excuse me, old-fashioned in this, is quite offensive, to use the expression. I feel that all the figures have to be, what's the word, put to the right, and that is standard accounting, the way we do it in accounting, and to put them centred, I don't believe presents the figures well, because it doesn't show the big figures from the small figures, and therefore I would strongly urge you to change the presentation of that, because I think that's quite important. In terms of, I think you just highlighted this comprehensive income and expenditure account, Dan, and personally I would have put the brackets all the other way around, but I understand where you're coming from. But the one thing I think you need to highlight is, in terms of the other comprehensive income and expenditure lines at the bottom, you should make it clear that the income is in brackets. Actually put brackets around the words income, because that clearly shows that it's in brackets. A lot of people, particularly accountants, I'm afraid, when they see brackets, they think loss, and therefore, and it's not in these particular terminologies. That's actually income. In terms of page, one question I did have is the balance sheet doesn't seem to be signed, and is that normal in local government accounts? I always, certainly in normal accounts, a balance sheet tends to be signed by some of the directors. The other thing that is just a commentary actually was the fact that the BCP have actually put in £60 million in terms of short-term investments. So although the cash resources may look as though they've gone down, your short-term investments have gone up by £60 million, which is quite an achievement, I think, for a new council. There was a couple of disclosure items which I wanted to query, if you don't mind, and those were on pages 52 and 53. 52, just bear with me. 52 is in terms of the members' allowances. As you can see, in the note 25 below it, in officers, you break it down. Personally, I think it would be transparent if there was some sort of breakdown of members' allowances. You've got a figure in there which probably should have an underlining underneath it of 1.15 million, and I, personally, I think those figures should be broken down and highlighted as to the category of councillor, whether they're cabinet or leader or whatever, and those should be specifically highlighted in the accounts. I think it's a good transparency. The other note was actually note 25, and the particularly in terms, I felt the disclosure on this was quite weak, and should be greater. And I'm thinking in particular of the expense allowances for the chief executive. No offence, chief executive, but I think that should be better explained, because having an expense allowance of £21,000 is quite unusual, and I know we've already had a letter about that maybe some of it is to do with an email, but some of it is to do with the relocation, and I think that should be explained, that it is relocation, because otherwise people might get the wrong impression that he's out whining and dining for £21,000, which I know, I'm sure he's not. So I think there's a better disclosure on note 25 would be in order. I think I better take a break now and let somebody else talk.
Thank you very much. So Mr. Povey and perhaps Mr. Richards on one or two of those. Would you like to come back where you're able? If you're not, then I'm sure that Councillor Cox will accept email response to some of those issues. Mr. Povey?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so in terms of the centering of the figures, yeah, I mean, you can do it either way. I take your point. Right justified, I think, was the term. Does let you see easily what the figures are. So that's something that we can chew over for the next time we do this. Definitely, it is consistent with how we report to Cabinet and Council. To do it in the middle, but okay. The brackets for income is the established way of doing it in the public sector accounts for credits. So debits are just whole figures and credits that have brackets. But I think you're definitely right. Having brackets around the words income would spell that out for the reader of the accounts. So absolutely. Adam, as the Section 151 officer, Chief Financial Officer, did approve the accounts at the 31st of July, and that's reflected in the date and the statement below the balance sheet, and also in the narrative report. I think when these are formally approved at the end of the audit, we will ask Adam to sign the balance sheet. So yes, we will do that. In terms of the areas of extra disclosure to do with, I think, note 25, the officer remuneration and the member allowances, the format of these notes is exactly in line with the code of practice. And as you remember from the previous auditor's report, where they made the comment that we were doing some additional disclosure, that involves extra audit effort to audit, but accepting that in the interest of transparency, which is why we did an additional disclosure on the members' allowances, that's probably something that if we could consider for next year would probably be good, because it's a bit of extra work. We're obviously up against it a little bit for this set of accounts, but I think we can consider any extra disclosures like that with proper discussion with the external auditor and see what we do for next year. And I don't know whether Adam would agree with that sentiment or not.
Before I respond, my question probably to my team was, there's something rattling around in the back of my head that says, regards to members' allowances, we used to publish them in local press in a detailed format. I can't remember whether or not that's still the convention or not. So, if it isn't, then maybe it is something that is appropriately included in the annual statement of accounts. If it is, then I think the transparency is there through another forum, and I wouldn't want to repeat it twice as part of that process. So I think it's something that we can take away and reflect on.
I believe it is, Adam, actually. I believe we still do still publish that detail.
Okay.
We may be able, therefore, to save some money by incorporating the same data in the statement of accounts. Turning it the other way. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Adam and Dan, for your presentation. I just wanted to comment really overall on the statement of accounts. What a good piece of work, in such a difficult year, and to have that complication of bringing the accounts of 4 organisations together and doing all of that with a new council and everything. I just think, really need to sort of thank you and thank everybody in your teams that's had involvement in this over that year and since the year to sort of close the accounts and sort this all out. So yeah, really good work. And I didn't make it along to the workshop to review the statement of accounts. I've attended quite a number of those briefings over the years, so I felt reasonably familiar with what was in the statement of accounts. But having looked through this one, I just feel it seemed to improve each year. And actually, the presentation of this one, I liked that bit more. And actually picking up, particularly in sections, I think Councillor Cox mentioned it, around sections 24, 25, 26 about officers' remuneration, etc. And I just note that there's additional information in there that we haven't always had before about exit packages, particularly because I know that some years ago there was press comment about how many staff were getting paid this, that and the other, but actually a lot of it was exit packages and redundancy packages, and now that's all clarified in there, saying that the figures do include exit costs, and it actually details, I think in section 26, about exit package remuneration, that just to clarify it so that people don't get the wrong idea and set hairs running and that sort of thing. So yeah, a very good piece of work, very robust financial performance under difficult circumstances, and a very good and clear, well presented report. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Brown, and I'd like to echo those sentiments as well, and commend the work that has been undertaken by the finance team. Councillor Cox, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, sorry, I just realised I missed one point that I meant to, and that's to do with the balance sheet. Whenever you're reading a set of accounts, one of the key areas you look at is the comparative. And it's always useful to look at what happened last year and compare lines. Now, I appreciate we didn't have a comparative, and this is the first year. So, in terms of the in terms of your income and expenditure account, there will be, it'll be difficult to do any comparisons. But I do think in terms of the balance sheet, it would be very useful to put the balance sheets together. And that's not difficult. You've got them on separate pages, one after the other, and therefore, to actually have a comparative, albeit being from the first, the comparative is from the 1st of July, 1st of April, 19. You could quite easily show a good comparative there, and I think it would certainly help the reader of the accounts to have those statements side by side or on the same page, effectively.
Could I come back on that, Chairman?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Councillor Cox. I think it is useful to have the comparatives there on the balance sheet, and actually the first iteration of accounts that we did for BCP for this year did that very thing, that it had the 1st of April balances alongside the 31st of March balances, but when the auditors looked at it, it isn't in compliance because of the way the council only came into existence on the 1st of April. We were asked to set up that note that you see on page 24 of the accounts, page 174 of the agenda, because strictly speaking, they're not comparatives because they're not the 31st of March because we didn't exist. But I take your point, and you'll see it's one of the audit adjustments that's referred to in the audit findings report on the previous item. But we did have discussions with that, and we were asked to move it. And to be fair to the auditors, we weren't code compliant when we added it into the balance sheet. But I agree with you, it would be jolly useful to have the numbers there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Povey. Nobody else has indicated. Oh, Mr. Richins, you'd like to come back on something, I think.
It's just to highlight, Chair, in the sense that you spoke about commending the work of me and my team with regards to the financial performance of the authority, but actually just to emphasise, it is a whole organisational response with regards to that financial management culture. So I don't think it is fair for me to sit here and just take that and accept that when actually it is members and every single officer of the council to its financial performance. So I think it is a whole organisational position.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Richins. We used to have this discussion when I was the portfolio holder for resources, finance in the days of Bournemouth Council. But you are the officers who are here this evening to receive the thanks of the committee on behalf of all of your fellow officers. And for that, I'm sure we all want to thank you, Mr. Povey, Mr. Filmer, who hasn't spoken, but I know plays a significant part as finance manager, and the rest of the team and the rest of the council. So take that that gratitude and compliment in the spirit in which it's given, please. It's well appreciated. So if we could move on to the recommendations, and there are two for this report. The first is to consider and approve the statement of accounts for 2019 and 2020, and the second is to agree that the chair of Audit and Governance Committee signs the statement of responsibilities included in the statement of accounts and the letter of representation on behalf of the committee once the audit is complete, as Mr. Richins described at the beginning of this item. I will take it that we are all in agreement with those two recommendations unless anybody indicates otherwise. And they haven't, so we are in agreement with those two recommendations. So thank you all very much indeed for that. It'll take us on then to the final item on our agenda this evening, which is the Audit and Governance Committee Forward Plan Refresh. And I'll ask Mr. Stannard to introduce this, and I'll make a quick couple of comments afterwards. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. obviously very self-explanatory appendix to this. We're increasingly towards the end of the municipal year now, and this forward plan goes right up to the end of the municipal year. You'll see that there's a merged cell towards the bottom of the review of the BH Live issues that you wanted to come back to this committee. It's still not apparent which committee it might be best to bring that back to. So I hope you don't mind that there's a bit of fluidity there, and we'll agree with you, Chairman, when it's appropriate to bring that back, given the issues that are going on and need to be resolved before it's sensible to bring that one back. And I've also noticed, and I think this is probably a bit of me being remiss actually, is that one of the recommendations we just agreed in the annual governance appendix 9 was to bring back the how we're doing on the action plan in January, and I can't see that on this particular version, so I'll make sure that that is there unless I've missed it, and I will get that changed and make sure that is brought back to the committee in January. Apologies for that, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. And just to add to what you said about the review of BH Live and the contractual and where we left this last time was that it was premature for us to really be looking at it until matters had progressed significantly further, maybe through to a conclusion, and B, once any other committee of the council have already undertaken whatever work they're responsible for, most particularly overview and scrutiny. And we felt it was appropriate for us to be, if you like, at the end of that queue, dealing with the governance issues after everybody else had done their work. So hence the reason for the delay. But when we do, we will come back hopefully with a presentation as well in order to explain what's been undertaken and indeed where the council relationship with BH Live has arrived at a conclusion. So I hope that satisfies members that it hasn't been forgotten. Are there any questions for the on the forward plan? No, well, if there aren't, could I just remind members of the committee of the email that I put out? I mentioned it earlier this evening. I really would like you to take a look at it, and if there are any items you want to be considered to come to audit and governance as additional items on the governance side of the council, could you refer back to my email of the 23rd of November? That's when I wrote it to you. If you've inadvertently deleted it or you can't find it, let me know, ping me a line, and I will send it to you again, because I'm very anxious that all 9 of us have input into this as members of the committee, and that we're dealing with work that we think is important around governance, as well as those regular items. So please let me know. In that case, the forward plan is for noting, so duly noted. And that brings us to the end of the agenda. Thank you very much indeed to officers who stayed the course throughout the evening. I know it's been a long meeting. It was always going to be. And I'm very grateful for members staying right through to the end as well. Very much appreciated. And thank you all extremely for your input. And I close the meeting at 8:58. Thank you all very much. Good night.